Number 10. The road to Cannae and the geography of disaster. Some ancient roads became feared because they ran through deserts, mountains, or zones of ambush. The road to Cannae is darker because it became terrifying through memory, through the realization that a route could lead not only to battle, but to one of the most devastating military disasters in Roman history. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Roads are supposed to help states move with confidence. They allow armies to march, supplies to follow, and command to extend itself across distance. But when a road leads an empire into catastrophe, the meaning of the landscape changes. It is no longer simply a line of approach. It becomes a corridor in which confidence, discipline, and strategic intention are drawn toward a place where they will be broken. What gave the road to Cannae its force also made it frightening. Rome depended on movement. Its military culture was built around the ability to mobilize men, hold territory, and impose will through organized advance. A road feeding into a battlefield therefore carried the full weight of Roman purpose. Troops did not move along it as frightened wanderers. They moved as part of a system that believed it could master opposition through discipline and scale. That is precisely why the route becomes so haunting in hindsight. The stronger the confidence marching forward, the darker the memory, when that confidence arrives at a place where the entire logic of power collapses into slaughter. The road does not merely lead to war, it leads to the failure of an imperial way of trusting itself. That is what makes this route feel so heavy. A battlefield disaster changes not only how a place is remembered, but how the approach to it is imagined. Every mile leading toward Cannae can be seen as part of an unfolding inevitability, a movement deeper into the trap before anyone fully grasps the scale of what is about to happen. The geography becomes psychologically charged. Open ground, marching order, strategic expectation all begin to feel sinister because they are tied to an outcome that will stain Roman memory for generations. A road associated with such a defeat is feared not because the stones themselves are cursed, but because they seem to carry the momentum of men walking toward destruction while still believing they are marching toward victory. The deeper lesson is that some routes become dangerous not only because enemies control them, but because they expose the fatal gap between movement and understanding. That is why the road to Cannae opens this list. It shows how a path can become part of a historical wound, a line of advance transformed into a memory of ruin. In that sense, the danger of the route lies not just in where it goes, but in what it reveals. That armies can travel in perfect order toward a place where order itself will no longer save them. Number 9. The Amber Route and the uneasy trade between worlds. Some ancient routes became dangerous because armies marched across them or empires fought to control them. The Amber Route is darker because its danger lived inside exchange itself in the unstable meeting of distant peoples, ambitions, desires, and unknown territories joined together by a trade good so valued that it could pull very different worlds into uneasy contact. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Trade routes are often imagined as civilizing lines, carrying wealth, craft, and communication across space. But when a route links radically different regions, cultures, and systems of power, the road becomes more than commercial. It becomes a corridor of uncertainty, where every transaction also carries the possibility of misunderstanding, dependency, exploitation, and exposure. What gave the Amber Route its importance also made it frightening. Amber was precious not only for its beauty, but for the way it connected northern sources to southern demand across a long chain of intermediaries, landscapes, and cultural frontiers. Such a route creates opportunity, but it also creates tension. People who need what lies far beyond their own world must trust roads they do not control, merchants they do not fully know, and territories whose dangers are often learned too late. The farther a good travels, the more the route accumulates hidden pressure. Wealth begins attracting risk. Contact begins producing imbalance. The road stops being a neutral channel and becomes a long negotiation between worlds that do not share the same assumptions, fears, or forms of authority. That is what makes the Amber Route feel so eerie. It was not simply a path to riches, it was a path through unfamiliarity. Every exchange along such a corridor raised deeper questions about who held real advantage, who understood the broader system, and who was being drawn into networks larger than they could fully see. A trader may think he is moving a luxury good. In reality, he is moving between spheres of culture, prestige, and power that can reshape one another without ever becoming stable. The route, therefore, carries a subtler kind of danger than a battlefield road. It does not always threaten with immediate violence. It threatens through exposure to difference, through the fragile trust of long-distance exchange, and through the fact that valuable goods often make a road more coveted, more competitive, and more precarious with every journey. The deeper lesson is that some roads become dangerous because they connect worlds that desire one another's resources more easily than they understand one another's realities. That is why the Amber Route takes this place on the list. It reveals how trade can produce a corridor of fascination and instability at the same time, a route where wealth moves together with uncertainty. In such a landscape, the danger is not only robbery or distance, it is the uneasy truth that every step along the road brings travelers into a chain of relationships stretching far beyond local control, until the route itself begins to feel like a narrow passage between worlds that were never entirely comfortable touching. Number 8. The Sacred Road to Delphi and the Burden of Pilgrimage. Some ancient routes became dangerous because armies used them, merchants fought over them, or empires turned them into instruments of control. The Sacred Road to Delphi is darker because its danger came from a different source entirely. The weight of approaching a place where people believed divine truth could be encountered, but never safely mastered. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Pilgrimage roads are often imagined as holy paths, lined with expectation, offerings, and reverent purpose. But the road to Delphi did not simply carry travelers toward comfort or blessing. It carried them toward an oracle whose authority rested on the possibility that the gods might answer in ways that transformed fate, unsettled judgment, or exposed truths no human being could hear without cost. A road leading to such a destination is never just a road. It becomes part of the emotional machinery of sacred dread. What gave the sacred road its force also made it frightening. Pilgrims, envoys, rulers, and petitioners did not travel there casually. They came because they believed the place at the end of the route could speak with a voice greater than ordinary human counsel. That means every step toward Delphi was already charged with uncertainty. The traveler was not only moving through space, he was moving toward revelation, and revelation in the ancient imagination is not necessarily merciful. It may clarify, but it may also disturb, warn, bind, or condemn. The road therefore becomes spiritually heavy long before the sanctuary is reached. The landscape itself begins to feel like preparation for an encounter the traveler cannot fully control. Sacred approach becomes a kind of slow tension, a movement toward knowledge that may alter the entire meaning of one's journey, one's kingdom, or one's life. That is what makes this route feel so haunting. Roads to holy places often promise peace, but roads to oracles promise exposure. The pilgrim arrives carrying questions, hopes, fears, and political stakes, yet none of those burdens grow lighter simply because the destination is sacred. They become sharper. The nearer one comes to Delphi, the more the act of travel begins to resemble submission to a force that may answer in ambiguity rather than comfort. That emotional atmosphere gives the road its darker character. It is not feared because it is physically impassable in the ordinary sense, but because it leads toward a confrontation with divine knowledge, and divine knowledge can wound just as easily as it can guide. The deeper lesson is that some routes become dangerous because the destination at the end of them is spiritually overwhelming enough to transform the path itself. That is why the sacred road to Delphi belongs on this list. It shows how a route of pilgrimage can become a corridor of dread when the holy place it serves is also a place of terrifying answers. In that sense, the danger of the road lies not only in the cliffs, the distance, or the effort of the ascent. It lies in the fact that every traveller knows he is walking toward a voice that may change everything, and that once the answer is heard, no one can ever claim they came only for the journey. Number 7. The Incense Route and the Cost of Desert Wealth. Some ancient routes became feared because invasion followed them or because disaster waited at the end of them. The Incense Route is darker because it reveals how wealth itself can make a road dangerous, especially when that wealth must cross vast desert spaces where survival, secrecy, and control are never guaranteed. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Incense was not merely a luxury commodity. It was tied to ritual, prestige, sacred space, and elite demand across multiple civilizations. A route carrying something so valued does not remain a simple commercial line for long. It becomes a corridor where merchants, intermediaries, rulers, and raiders all understand that enormous value is moving through some of the harshest landscapes in the ancient world. In such a setting, the road stops looking like a path of prosperity and begins to look like a moving target stretched across the desert. What gave the incense route its force also made it frightening. Desert trade depends on knowledge, timing, water, alliances, and endurance. A traveller cannot simply set out with wealth and expect the land to accommodate him. Every stage of the route demands trust in guides, caravans, stopping points, and political arrangements that may or may not hold. The farther the goods move, the more vulnerable they become to climate, exhaustion, betrayal, and predation. Yet precisely because incense was so valuable, the route had to be used again and again. That creates a grim paradox. The road becomes indispensable because of the wealth it carries, but that same wealth ensures that danger gathers around it with every journey. Desert emptiness does not reduce the pressure. It intensifies it, because there are so few margins for error once the caravan is far from safety. That is what makes the incense route feel so eerie. It is a road of sacred fragrance passing through landscapes where death is never far away. Goods meant for temples, palaces, and ceremonies move across terrain where thirst, exposure, and attack are constant possibilities. The contrast is psychologically powerful. Something associated with worship and refinement depends on a path shaped by harsh survival and hidden violence. The route therefore becomes more than a trade line. It becomes a test of whether value can be carried through a world that seems determined to strip travellers down to their limits. Every successful caravan proves the route's importance. Every failure reminds everyone watching that desert wealth is purchased with risk at every step. The deeper lesson is that some roads become dangerous because what moves along them is too precious to leave behind and too difficult to protect completely. That is why the incense route takes this place on the list. It shows how trade, sacred demand, and extreme geography can combine to produce a corridor where profit and peril are inseparable. In such a landscape, the road does not merely lead to riches. It demands that travellers wager themselves against the desert in order to keep the world's hunger for sacred luxury alive. Number 6. The Alpine crossings that broke armies. Some ancient routes became dangerous because enemies guarded them, deserts consumed them, or trade made them worth attacking. The Alpine crossings are darker because the danger lived in the mountains themselves, in the brutal fact that an army could march toward glory and still find that stone, snow, height, and exposure were more merciless than any enemy waiting beyond the pass. That is what makes these crossings so unsettling. Mountain routes tempt empires because they promise access, surprise, and the possibility of taking war where it is not expected. But mountains do not behave like obedient roads. They narrow movement, slow command, fracture formations, and turn weather into a force capable of humiliating even the most ambitious military design. An army entering such a landscape does not simply advance. It submits itself to terrain that can reduce discipline, logistics, and morale to something painfully fragile. What gave the Alpine crossings their strategic force also made them frightening. They mattered precisely because powerful states and commanders believed they could be used to shift history, outmaneuver opponents, and carry armies across what should have been barriers. That belief is what fills the passes with dread. Once a route becomes famous for the movement of armies, every slope, ravine, and icy turn begins to look like part of a larger test, not only of courage but of whether human ambition has overestimated its right to pass. In the mountains, the line between strategy and ordeal becomes very thin. Troops do not only face the possibility of combat, they face cold that strips away strength, altitude that punishes the body, narrow paths that undo cohesion, and the constant knowledge that one collapse, one slide, one broken supply line can make the route itself more destructive than the campaign it was meant to serve. That is what makes these crossings feel so haunting. A road through mountains changes the psychology of movement. Progress becomes precarious. Every gain in elevation can feel like deeper exposure. Men and animals move not through controlled imperial space, but through a landscape that never truly belongs to them. The mountains keep reminding travelers that passage is conditional. Even victory on the far side does not erase what the route has already cost. Armies emerge diminished, shaken or transformed by the fact that geography itself has judged them before battle ever begins. In that sense, the Alpine crossings become more than military passages. They become proving grounds where empire learns that there are places in the world where force cannot simply command its way forward. The deeper lesson is that some routes become dangerous because they reveal how little human organization matters when the land itself turns hostile enough. That is why the Alpine crossings belong on this list. They show how a pass can carry the memory of great historical movement while still feeling like a corridor of attrition, where every step upward tests whether ambition deserves to survive the climb. In such a place, the road does not only lead armies onward, it breaks them first. Number 5, the Via Egnatia and the March of Empires. Some ancient roads became feared because they led to disaster or crossed landscapes too severe for ordinary travel. The Via Egnatia is darker because it became dangerous through relentless usefulness, through the fact that it served so well as a corridor of imperial movement that it repeatedly exposed whole regions to the marching weight of armies, officials, ambitions, and political upheaval. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Roads built by empires are often admired as achievements of order, engineering, and connectivity. But a road that efficiently links worlds also allows power to move with frightening speed. Once a route becomes indispensable to imperial communication and conquest, it stops being merely a convenience. It becomes a channel through which history can arrive in armored form, again and again, until the people living along it know that every horizon may be carrying the next wave of control. What gave the Via Egnatia its force also made it frightening. It connected the Adriatic world to the Balkans and onward, toward the eastern Mediterranean, which meant it served not only merchants and travellers, but generals, administrators, messengers, and rivals for power. Such a road concentrates consequence. It turns geography into an instrument of empire, allowing armies to reach places that might otherwise have remained harder to dominate. But the more efficient the route becomes, the more dangerous it is for everyone who must live beside it or move along it without protection. A road of empire does not belong equally to all who use it. It belongs most of all to those who can command movement at scale. That imbalance gives the Via Egnatia its darker atmosphere. It is a road of connection, but also a road of exposure, where the infrastructure of civilization doubles as the infrastructure of invasion. That is what makes the Via Egnatia feel so heavy. People often imagine roads as reducing uncertainty, but some roads simply distribute uncertainty faster. A community situated along such a corridor may gain commerce, contact, and strategic importance, yet it also gains vulnerability. Armies pass through. Political crises spread. Imperial contests used the road as a spine. The route carries not only goods, but the rhythm of larger powers colliding over territory, succession, and control. Travelers on it do not move through neutral space. They move through a line already marked by the intentions of states. That means the road is never only physical, it is psychological. To enter it is to step into a channel where someone else's empire may already be moving toward you. The deeper lesson is that some routes become dangerous because they are too successful at carrying power where power wants to go. That is why the Via Egnatia takes this place on the list. It reveals how an imperial road can look like a triumph of civilization while functioning as a corridor of repeated pressure, a route that enables history to march across human landscapes with unnerving efficiency. In such a case, the danger is not that the road fails. The danger is that it works exactly as intended, and in doing so makes entire regions permanently accessible to the ambitions of empire. Number 4. The Silk Road through the Taklamakan's edge. Some ancient routes became dangerous because armies used them or because empires fought to control them. The Silk Road along the edge of the Taklamakan is darker because it turned trade itself into a prolonged encounter with emptiness, uncertainty, and the constant possibility that one mistake could erase a traveller from history. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The Silk Road is often imagined as a grand civilizational network, a shimmering line of exchange carrying silk, ideas, religions, technologies, and wealth across the ancient world. But at the Taklamakan's edge, that image becomes far more ominous. Here the road was never a single safe highway cutting through a stable landscape. It was a fragile chain of routes skirting one of the most unforgiving desert environments on Earth, where survival depended on precision, local knowledge, and the ability to remain close enough to life-giving margins without slipping too far into the dead center of the sands. What gave this stretch of the Silk Road its force also made it frightening. It mattered because distant worlds needed one another badly enough to keep crossing terrain that could kill them. Trade on that scale promised profit, prestige, and the expansion of human contact, but the road did not offer those things freely. It demanded endurance, guides, caravans, oasis knowledge, and trust in places that were never fully under any traveller's control. A desert edge route has a particular kind of dread because it constantly reminds people how thin the line is between movement and disappearance. The road exists, but only as long as memory, water, and timing hold together. If those fail, the landscape does not negotiate. It swallows. That is what makes the Taklamakan edge feel so haunting. A road passing near such a desert becomes more than a trade corridor. It becomes a moving argument against oblivion. Each oasis is not merely a stop. It is proof that survival has not yet been withdrawn. Each caravan is not merely transporting goods. It is trying to preserve continuity through a geography that seems almost designed to erase continuity. The farther the journey extends, the more psychologically heavy the route becomes. Wealth moves along it, but so does exhaustion, fear, and the knowledge that beyond the habitable margins lies an expanse where the traveller's name, cargo, and body may vanish without leaving enough trace for the wider world to remember. The deeper lesson is that some roads become dangerous because they connect civilizations only by threading them along the edge of annihilation. That is why this Silk Road corridor belongs so high on the list. It shows how one of history's most famous networks of exchange depended in places on a route so exposed to desert indifference that movement itself became an act of controlled defiance. In such a landscape, the road does not simply carry history forward. It keeps history from being buried in sand, one caravan at a time. Number 3. The Appian Way and the public memory of Roman power. Some ancient roads became dangerous because they crossed wild terrain, opened the door to invasion, or tempted travelers with wealth at terrible cost. The Appian Way is darker because its danger came from something more political and more deliberate. It was one of the clearest examples of a road becoming a public theatre of state power, where movement, punishment, and memory were fused into one unnerving imperial statement. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Roman roads are often praised as symbols of order, discipline, and administrative genius, and the Appian Way certainly embodied all of that. It linked Rome to the south, moved armies, facilitated control, and demonstrated what an expansionist republic and empire could do when they decided to make the land obey. But a road like this does more than connect places. It teaches people what power looks like when it decides to make itself visible mile after mile. What gave the Appian Way its force also made it frightening. It was straight, purposeful, and unmistakably Roman, which meant that anyone travelling on it was moving through a landscape already shaped by the intentions of the state. Roads like this do not simply help armies travel. They allow the centre to reach outward with confidence, carrying command, law, and retribution into the provinces and back again. Yet the road's deeper darkness lies in the fact that Roman power did not always present itself gently. It could use the very visibility of the route to turn punishment into a warning. Once a road becomes associated not only with military movement and imperial reach, but with the public staging of terror, its stones begin to carry a different kind of memory. The traveller is no longer just crossing distance. The traveller is passing through a message. That is what makes the Appian Way feel so heavy in historical imagination. It was a road of civilization, but also a road of demonstration. Rome did not merely govern. Rome showed that it governed, and the road was one of the places where that showing became unforgettable. A route lined in memory with the consequences of defiance changes the emotional meaning of travel. The road is efficient, but it is also watching. It invites movement, but it does so under the sign of a power willing to mark the landscape with examples of what happens to those who challenge it. In that sense, the danger of the Appian Way is not rooted in banditry or environmental hardship alone. It lies in the realization that the state has made the route itself part of its language of domination. The deeper lesson is that some roads become dangerous because they do not merely serve empire. They display it in ways meant to shape fear. That is why the Appian Way takes this place near the top of the list. It reveals how infrastructure can become psychological weaponry, how a road admired for its engineering can also function as a corridor where Roman order and Roman threat move together. In such a place, the traveller is not simply going from one city to another. He is moving through the public memory of imperial power, and that memory is meant to be strong enough that no one ever mistakes the road for neutral ground. Number 2. The Khyber Pass as a gateway for conquest. Some ancient routes became dangerous because they carried trade through hostile terrain or led pilgrims towards spiritually overwhelming destinations. The Khyber Pass is darker because it became feared as one of history's most enduring corridors of invasion, a route where geography itself seemed to invite the passage of armies, ambitions, and imperial disruption. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Mountain passes are never truly neutral. They compress movement, expose travellers, and force human intention through narrow terrain where control is always fragile. But the Khyber became something more than a difficult passage. It became a gateway, a place where worlds touched under pressure, where powers from one side could force their way toward the other, and where entire regions learned to associate the pass with the arrival of conquest. What gave the Khyber its force also made it frightening. It mattered because it linked major cultural and political spheres that could not ignore one another forever. A pass like this turns distance into access, and access into vulnerability. For merchants, envoys, migrants, and soldiers, it could be a route of possibility. For the societies living beyond it, that same possibility could look like danger gathering in the mountains before spilling into the plains. Once a route becomes known as an invasion corridor, the landscape itself changes meaning. Heights are no longer just heights. Defiles are no longer just geography. Every narrow turn begins to feel like the threshold of historical pressure, because what comes through the pass may not simply arrive. It may overturn what was there before. That is what makes the Khyber feel so haunting. A gateway for conquest creates a special kind of dread because it combines repetition with uncertainty. People know the route matters. They know it has carried armies before. They know it may carry them again. Yet they can never fully predict when the next movement will come, in what strength, or with what consequences. The pass therefore becomes psychologically active long before an army appears. It lives in memory as a source of exposure, a place where the barrier between safety and upheaval is dangerously thin. Civilizations on either side may prosper, organize, and believe in their continuity, but the existence of the gateway means continuity never feels entirely secure. The mountains are not just watching over the world. They are holding open a wound through which history can return in armed form. The deeper lesson is that some routes become dangerous because they transform geography into recurring opportunity for conquest. That is why the Khyber Pass takes the number 2 place on this list. It reveals how a path through hard terrain can become one of the great strategic openings of history, a place whose very usefulness ensures that it remains tied to fear. In such a corridor, movement is never innocent. To pass through it is to enter a landscape already burdened by the memory of armies, the expectation of violence, and the knowledge that what comes through the mountains may change the fate of everything waiting beyond them. Number 1. The Royal Road and the Fear of Imperial Reach. Some ancient roads became dangerous because they led armies into disaster, carried wealth through merciless landscapes, or opened the way for conquest. The Royal Road is darker than almost any of them because it represents the moment a route stops being merely a path and becomes the living nervous system of empire itself. That is what makes the case so chilling. A road built, organized, and maintained on that scale does more than connect cities. It allows a central power to move messages, officials, armies, tribute, and will across immense distances with terrifying efficiency. From one angle, that is an extraordinary administrative achievement. From another, it is profoundly unnerving because it means that the empire is no longer far away in any reassuring sense. It can reach. What gave the Royal Road its force also made it frightening. It existed to reduce delay, to overcome the weakness of distance, and to make imperial authority feel immediate even across vast territory. That is precisely why it becomes the darkest route on this list. Distance once offered protection. Mountains, plains, and regional separation once gave local worlds room to breathe. But a road like this weakens those buffers. It allows the center to see farther, command faster, and punish more effectively. A governor who hesitates, a province that resists, a subject people that imagines imperial attention is too distant to matter, all must now reckon with the fact that the road has narrowed the gap between local action and imperial response. The route does not simply carry traffic. It carries surveillance, discipline, and the unnerving possibility that power can arrive before resistance has even finished imagining itself safe. That is what makes the Royal Road feel so heavy. Unlike a pass feared for invasion or a desert route feared for exposure, this road is feared because it works too well. Its danger is built into its success. The more efficiently it transmits orders, resources, and force, the more completely it transforms the relationship between ruler and ruled. Communities along or within its network no longer live at the edge of empire in the old sense. They live inside the reach of a system designed to collapse space for the sake of control. The road becomes a political fact as much as a physical one. To travel it is to move through infrastructure that has already been claimed by the logic of domination. To live under it is to understand that the empire has found a way to make remoteness less meaningful than it used to be. The deeper lesson is that some routes become dangerous not because they fail to hold civilization together, but because they hold empire together too effectively. That is why the Royal Road takes the number 1 place on this list. It captures one of the darkest truths in ancient history. Roads do not merely connect worlds. In the hands of a powerful state, they can become instruments for overcoming the protective limits of geography itself. Once that happens, the road stops being just a line across the land. It becomes the proof that power has learned how to travel faster than fear can escape it.